The cold woke him before the light did. Hansu shuddered and tried to breathe, but the air entered his lungs too easily. Not enough air. His chest was too small. He opened his eyes and saw the dark ceiling beams covered in thick soot. The smell of damp clay and boiled grass hung in the air. Hansu raised his hand. It was thin, like a child's. His fingers trembled in front of his face. These weren't his hands. His hands were broad and rough, with cracks on his knuckles from 30 years of working in the fields. But these hands belonged to a child. He sat up on the straw mattress and looked at his body. Skinny legs, pointed knees, ribs visible beneath the thin shirt. A boy of about 11, maybe 10. The body was weak and empty, like the earth after 5 years without rest. Hansu closed his eyes. A single clear thought filled his mind. He was dead. He was definitely dead. The pain in his chest, in his own field in Jeonju, the heat of that August day. The ground had hit him in the face. And that was it. And now he was sitting in a stranger's body, in a strange place, feeling the child's empty stomach cramp with hunger. The door creaked. An old woman entered the room, a hunched back, a gray linen dress, gray hair gathered under a headscarf, a face like the bark of an old tree. She was carrying a clay bowl and a spoon. She set them on the floor in front of him. She said he had missed morning prayers and that the soup had already gone cold. She called him by name, Hansu. He looked into the bowl, a murky greenish liquid, a few overcooked stalks, not a single piece of anything substantial. He picked up the spoon and tasted it. Grass, just boiled grass with a pinch of salt. No calcium, no protein, no fat. This is what children grow on. This is what makes them sick and causes them to die in the winter. The farmer inside him knew this right away. 38 years of life hadn't been erased along with his body. Hans drank the soup down to the last drop because a child's body had no right to refuse food. Then he stood up. His legs were shaking. He went out into the yard and stopped at the threshold. The village lay before him. 13 houses made of gray stone and clay, thatched roofs, a muddy road running through the middle. To the right stood a temple, or rather, what was left of it. Half the roof had caved in. The walls were covered with moss. The stone statue at the entrance had lost its face to time and rain. Fields stretched out to the left. Hansu looked at them, and the farmer's heart inside him sank. The land was dead. Not quite dead, but on the brink. Gray, hardened clay, cracked and parched. Stunted rows of cabbage with yellowed leaves. Weeds grew better than the crops. He'd seen this 1,000 times in his past life. Monoculture. Year after year, the same thing in the same place. The land had given all it could and was now dying. 200 years of treatment like this, and any soil would turn to dust. An old woman came out behind him. She stood beside him. She said his name was Mother Elva, and that she had been looking after him ever since he was left alone. She said he needed to help in the kitchen today. Hansu nodded, but he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the ground. Then he turned and walked behind the woodshed. Mother Elva called out to him. He didn't answer. Behind the shed was a corner of the yard where no one ever went. Trampled earth, a couple of old planks, nettles by the wall. Hansu knelt down and touched the ground with his palm. Hard, dry on top. He dug with his fingers. Under the top layer, the clay was slightly softer, not hopelessly. He stood up and went to look for a shovel. He found a rusty spade with a cracked handle in the shed. He returned to the corner. He began to dig. The child's body resisted from the very first blow. His hands were weak. The spade was heavy. The clay wouldn't give way. Hans struck the ground again and again. After 20 blows, his arms were burning. After 50, red spots appeared on his palms. After 100, he stopped to catch his breath. The hole was pitiful. 30 centimeters deep, half a meter wide. A compost bin needs a hole 1 meter by 1 meter and at least half a meter deep. Better yet, 2 by 2. He looked at his hands. Red, sore, small. Then he looked at the hole. Then he picked up the spade again. 38 years of patience trapped in the body of an 11-year-old boy. He would dig for as long as it took. By noon, the hole had grown to the right size. Hansu sat next to it, right on the ground. His back ached, his hands were shaking. The first blister on his right palm had burst, blood mixed with the clay. He looked at the hole and thought. The compost bin needed filling, organic matter, kitchen scraps, leaves, grass, ash, then time, at least 2 months for hot compost, 4 for cold. In this world, he knew neither the seasons, nor the temperatures, nor the local plants. He'd have to figure it all out by trial and error. Make mistakes, try again. Mother Elva found him around lunchtime. She stood over the hole and looked at it for a long time. She asked why the boy had dug a hole behind the shed. Hansu replied that it was for kitchen scraps. He said that if you put food scraps and ashes in one place and cover them properly with grass, in 2 months you'd get black soil, the best soil for planting. Mother Elva stared at him without blinking. Then she asked how he knew that. Hansu shrugged. He said he'd seen it somewhere. He didn't remember where. The old nun was silent for a long time. Then she nodded. She said she would bring the kitchen scraps herself. Hansu didn't yet know who this woman really was. He didn't know that 30 years ago she had served under the high priestess of the goddess of the harvest. He didn't know that she hadn't come to this impoverished village by chance. He didn't know what she was waiting for. He simply saw a kind old woman who had allowed him to dig holes and carry trash. That was enough. In the evening, Hansu returned to the kitchen. He helped peel the root vegetables for the stew. 2 small roots for 8 servings. He peeled them and counted in his head. 80 residents. Mostly old people and children looked emaciated. Winter was coming. Last winter, 4 children had died. If nothing changed, this winter would take just as many. He had the knowledge. 30 years of experience. Crop rotation, compost, green manure, drip irrigation, mulching, symbiotic planting. It all works, but it works slowly. The first real harvest in 6 months, at best. Winter is 4 months away. The math didn't add up. He wouldn't make it in time. Hansu put down the knife. He looked at his hands. The calluses stung. Dried blood had formed a brown crust. He picked up the knife again and continued. If he won't make it in time, then so be it. That means he has to start with what he can do right now. Tomorrow he'll begin gathering everything suitable for compost. Every leaf, every stem, every handful of ash. 2 square meters, 1 hole, 1 pair of small hands. It's always scary to start, but the earth won't wait. It either dies or lives, and it's up to the one standing on it to decide. On the second morning, Hansu woke up before dawn. His body ached as if he'd been beaten with sticks. His back, his hands, his shoulders, every muscle reminded him of yesterday's work. He sat on the mattress and spent a long time clenching and unclenching his fingers. The calluses on his right palm had cracked overnight. His left hand was swollen at the base of his thumb. A child's body wasn't made for such labor. But Hansu got up, because the land waits for no one. He stepped out into the yard in the pre-dawn twilight. The air was damp and cold. Dew lay on the stones. Hansu walked past the temple to the back wall of the kitchen. There stood a wooden tub where waste was dumped. scraps, stems, rotten leaves. Usually this was carried to the edge of the village and dumped into a ditch. Hansu leaned over the tub. He sniffed. Normal organic matter. No meat, no fat. Pure plant waste. Perfect for compost. He dragged the tub to his pit behind the shed. The tub was heavier than he'd expected. The child inside his body groaned with the strain. The farmer inside his head calculated the proportions. A layer of waste, a layer of soil, a layer of dry grass. Repeat. Monitor the moisture. Don't overwater. Don't let it dry out. Back in Jeonju, he'd done this with his eyes closed. Here, everything was different. Different soil, different climate, different plants. But the principle was the same. Organic matter plus time plus air equals fertility. He tipped the bucket into the hole. He smoothed it out with his hands. He went to gather some soil. He spread a thin layer on top. Then he gathered some dry grass by the fence and laid it down as a third layer. The first batch was ready. Now it was time to add to it every day and wait. A week later, it rained. Hans was both delighted and frightened. Rain is necessary for compost, but the pit had no cover. If it got flooded with water, the decomposition process would go awry. It would turn into a swamp instead of compost. He ran to the shed. He found an old board. He placed it across the top of the pit at an angle so the water would run off. He stood in the rain and watched. The board held. The water ran off to the side. Hansu returned to the kitchen, soaked to the skin. Mother Elva shook her head. She gave him a dry shirt. She didn't say a word. By the end of the first week, a routine had settled in. Up before dawn, the bucket of waste, the pit, layers, then work in the kitchen, then back to the pit, check the moisture, stir it with a stick, check for mold of the wrong color. White mold is good, black mold is bad. Green mold is bad too. Hansu was learning all over again. In Jeonju, he'd known every mushroom and every bacterium by its smell. Here, he had to guess. On the 8th day, Mother Elva approached him as he sat by the pit, stirring the contents with a stick. She stood beside him. She was silent. Then she asked what he was doing there every morning and every evening. Hansu explained. He said that kitchen scraps weren't trash. He said they were food for the earth. He said that if you put everything together the right way and waited 2 months, you'd get a substance that makes any soil fertile. No magic, no crystals, it's just time and care. Mother Elva listened in silence. Then she asked how an 11-year-old boy knew such things. Hansu looked her in the eyes. He said he didn't remember. Maybe he'd dreamed it. Maybe he'd heard it from someone a long time ago. The old nun looked at him for a long time. There was something strange in her eyes. Not suspicion, not fear. Something like recognition, as if she had seen what she had expected to see. Then she nodded and left. The next day, a second bucket stood next to the waste bucket. Mother Elva began separating the ashes from the kitchen scraps. Ashes in one place, kitchen scraps in another. Hansu hadn't asked her to do this. She did it on her own. By the end of the second week, Hansu decided it was time to move on. The compost would be ready in a month and a half, maybe 2, but he couldn't wait. He needed a garden bed. A small one. An experimental one. 2 square meters next to the compost pit. He began preparing the soil. The soil here was better than in the fields. The corner behind the shed hadn't been used for decades. Weeds and nettles, though sparse, kept some life in the soil. Hansu pulled out the nettles. He left the roots in the ground. They'll rot and become fertilizer. He dug up the topsoil. The clay was dense, but not lifeless. He broke up the clumps with his hands, every single one, for hours. His hands bled. Calluses burst open and grew back. Mother Elva would silently leave a bowl of soup and a piece of flatbread by the shed. Hansu ate without stopping his work. By the 3rd week, the children came to him. 3 of them. A boy of about 9 named Tovi, a girl named Ronnie, 7 years old, and the very little Pico, who looked about 5. They stood by the barn and watched. Tovi asked why Hansu was digging in the dirt. Hansu replied that he was planting food. Tovi laughed. He said that food grows in the fields, not behind the shed. Hansu said that if Tovi helped gather leaves from the other side of the road, in 3 months Hansu would give him a pumpkin. A whole pumpkin, just for him. Tovi stopped laughing. A whole pumpkin? They hadn't seen one in the valley for 2 years. The last pumpkin harvest had been so small that each pumpkin had been cut into 8 pieces. Tovi ran off to gather leaves. Ronnie and Pico ran after him. By evening, there was a mountain of leaves by the pit. Hansu put them in the compost. He showed the children how to alternate the layers, wet and dry, green and brown. Tovi listened with his mouth agape. Ronnie took it all in silently. Pico poked at the ground with a stick and was happy simply because his older siblings were there. In the 4th week, Hansu planted the seeds. He'd found them in the kitchen in an old little bag that Mother Elva kept on the top shelf. Pumpkin, beans, something like peas. The seeds were old, maybe 2 years, maybe 3. The germination rate would be low, but there was no choice. Hansu soaked the seeds in warm water overnight. In the morning, he planted them. The pumpkin and the beans side by side. Beans fix nitrogen in the soil. The pumpkin spreads leaves and protects the soil from drying out. A 3rd companion plant was missing, a corn-like plant, a tall stalk for the beans to climb. Hansu asked Mother Elva if there was anything tall and grass-like in the village. She thought for a moment and said that a wild stalk grew in the distant field as tall as 2 people. The ears are small and bitter. No one eats it. Hansu asked her to bring him some seeds. Mother Elva gave him a strange look, but the next day, a small bundle of the plant's seeds lay on the kitchen table. Hansu planted them between the pumpkin and the beans. 3 sisters. The plant will provide height and support. The beans will provide nitrogen. The pumpkin will cover the ground. Everyone helps everyone else. Just like in a village, if the village functions properly. Now all that was left was to wait. Hansu didn't like waiting. In his past life, he could distract himself with paperwork, the market, or conversations with neighbors. Here, he was a child with no rights and no voice. No one but Mother Elva knew what he was doing. No one but the 3 children cared. The village went about its hard life. The old people sat by their houses. The women cooked up meals out of nothing. The few remaining men went out to the fields and returned empty-handed. Village head Grove walked around the village, grumbling that this year would be even worse than the last. Hansu could hear his voice through the barn wall. Grove said they needed to ask the order again to send a mage with crystals, that without the crystals there would be no harvest at all, that a single crystal was worth a whole family's year's work, but without them, the land would yield nothing. Hansu sat by his garden bed and listened in silence. Fertility crystals. He didn't yet know what they were. He didn't know how they worked. He didn't know that behind them lay an entire system of power and money. He knew only one thing. The earth doesn't need magic. The earth needs to be treated properly. If he was right, then the crystals were a lie. And if the crystals were a lie, then the entire system was built on deception. But that was for later. Right now, he had a compost pit, a 2x2 garden bed, 3 handfuls of seeds, and a body that ached from head to toe. Hansu lay down on the ground next to the garden bed. He pressed his cheek against the loamy soil. He closed his eyes. Back in Jeonju, he used to do this after a hard day. He'd lie down in this field and listen. The earth always speaks. You just have to know how to hear it. This earth was silent, but not dead. Tired. like a person who had carried too heavy a load for too long. Hansu whispered into the earth that he was here, that he would help, that she no longer had to carry the burden alone. The first sprouts appeared on the 9th day after planting. Hansu saw them in the morning, 2 pale beanstalks, thin, frail, but alive. He crouched in front of the garden bed and stared at them for so long that Tovi came to check if he'd fallen asleep. Hansu hadn't fallen asleep. He was calculating. 9 days until sprouting at the local temperature and humidity. That meant the growing season would be longer than in Jeonju. That meant the harvest from this garden bed would be small by winter. But there would be one. On the 12th day, a stem sprouted. A thick sprout with a brown tip. Strong. Hansu felt something like pride, but immediately suppressed that feeling. 1 sprout means nothing. The pumpkin remained silent. Of the 6 seeds, not a single one had sprouted. Hansu checked every morning. He dug with his finger near the planting spot. Carefully. Just a millimeter. On the 15th day, he found 1 seed. It had rotted. The humidity was too high after the rains, or the seeds were too old, or both. He'd lost the pumpkin. First mistake. Hansu sat by the garden bed and thought. In Jeonju, he would have gone to a neighbor and bought new seeds. Here, there was nowhere to go. Seeds in this world are more precious than silver. The village guards every single seed. Tovi approached and asked where the pumpkin was. Hansu replied that the pumpkin hadn't grown, that he'd made a mistake. Tovi looked at him for a long time. Then he said that his grandfather had also said that the earth wouldn't obey, that nothing would grow without crystals. Hansu replied that Tovi's grandfather was wrong, that the earth does obey. You just have to learn how to talk to it. Tovi asked how. Hansu said he didn't know yet, but he would find out. By the 2nd month, the beans had risen a palm's width from the ground. The stem had grown 2 palms tall. Hansu tied the beanstalks to the main stem with a thin grass rope. The beans began to twine. The system was working. Slowly, but it was working. The compost in the pit began to change color. The top layer darkened. The smell changed. In the first few weeks, it had smelled sour and rotten. Now it smelled like earth. Warm, dark, living earth. Hansu reached his hand into the center of the pile. It was hot. The temperature inside had risen. The process was going as it should. He pulled his hand out and sniffed his fingers. That's what fertility smells like. Mother Elva now came to the pit every evening. She stood nearby and watched. Sometimes she asked questions. Hansu explained. He talked about bacteria, though he didn't know how to say the word in the local language. He said that tiny, invisible creatures ate the waste and turned it into food for plants. Mother Elva listened. She nodded. Once she said that the goddess of the harvest had taught the same thing, that the earth is alive, that it contains invisible helpers. Hansu froze. He asked how she knew that. Mother Elva said she had read it in the temple's old scrolls long ago, when she was young. Hansu asked to see the scrolls. Mother Elva shook her head. She said the scrolls had burned along with the temple roof 20 years ago, but she remembers. Hansu sat down next to her on an upside-down bucket. He asked her to tell him what she remembered. The old nun spoke until dark. Hansu listened. Most of it consisted of prayers and parables that had no practical value, but he committed 3 things to memory. First, the goddess of the harvest taught to rotate crops, not to plant the same thing 2 years in a row. Second, the goddess spoke of plants that nourish the soil rather than deplete it, green manure. Third, the goddess forbade leaving the soil bare. The soil must always be covered, mulching. Hansu realized 2 things. Either the goddess of the harvest was real and knew agronomy, or The ancient priests understood these principles and clothed them in the form of religion. In any case, this knowledge existed in this world long before the crystals. Someone destroyed it or allowed it to be forgotten. This thought took root in his mind and wouldn't let him rest. But now was not the time for investigations. In the 5th week, village elder Grove appeared. Hansu was just turning the compost with a wooden stick when a shadow blocked the sun. Grove stood over the pit. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face was red from the wind and anger. He said the whole village stank because of that pit. He said the boy was messing around instead of helping out in the communal fields. He said he'd send people tomorrow to fill that hole with dirt. Hansu looked up at him. The difference in height was enormous. Grove was like a rock. Hansu was like a pebble at its base. Hansu replied calmly. He said the hole was necessary, that in a month it would produce the best soil Grove had ever seen in his entire life. That if Grove filled in the hole, he'd lose 2 months' worth of work. Grove turned crimson. He said the boy had gotten too bold. That no sniveling brat was going to tell the village elder what to do on his own land. He swung his fist. He didn't hit him, but he swung it. Hansu didn't flinch. The child's body wanted to run away. Every muscle was screaming, "Run!" But the adult inside stood his ground. He'd seen men like Grove dozens of times. Old, stubborn men who fear change more than they fear hunger. Words won't change their minds, only by results. Grove spat and walked away. He promised to come back tomorrow with shovels. Hansu sat down by the pit and wrapped his arms around his knees. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from helplessness. He was an 11-year-old boy, an orphan working in the temple kitchen. He had no rights, no voice, no protection. If the village elder decided to fill in the pit, no one would stop him. The next morning, Grove arrived. With him were 2 men carrying shovels. They stood by the pit. Grove ordered them to fill it in. And then Mother Elva emerged from around the corner of the barn. She walked slowly. In her right hand was a rolling pin. Not a wooden one, a stone one. A heavy temple rolling pin used to roll out ritual dough. Mother Elva stood between the pit and the men. She looked at Grove. She said 3 words. "This land belongs to the temple." Grove opened his mouth and closed it. The land behind the barn did indeed belong to the temple, not to the community. The village elder had no right to dispose of it. Mother Elva added that the boy was working with the temple's blessing. If the village head had any complaints, he should take them up with priest Melis. Grove looked at the rolling pin. He looked at the nun. Then he turned around and walked away. The men with shovels followed him. Hansu stood behind Mother Elva, breathing heavily. His hands were shaking. So were his legs. Mother Elva turned around. She looked down at him. She told him not to stand there like a statue, but to go turn over his pile. Hansu nodded. He walked over to the pit. He picked up a stick. He began turning the compost. His hands were still shaking, but he worked, because the earth won't wait. Later that evening, something else happened. Priest Melis came to the garden bed, a thin man with a pale face and sharp eyes. He looked at the sprouts. He looked at the hole. Then he looked at Hansu. He said that Grove had come to him with a complaint. He said that, as a priest, he had to decide whether the boy could continue. He asked what Hansu was doing. Hansu explained, briefly, in simple words. The priest listened without interrupting. Then he said one sentence. He said that the goddess's gifts cannot be hastened by human hands. Hansu replied that he wasn't hastening anything. that he was simply helping the earth do what it was already doing, only faster and better. Melis frowned. He said it was all the same. He turned and left. Hansu was left alone. He knew that Melis wouldn't help. He knew the priest would watch and wait for failure. That was normal. Let him watch. Let him wait. The result would speak for itself. But inside, it was hard. A 38-year-old man in a child's body, alone against a village accustomed to dying. He looked at the bean sprouts. They swayed in the wind, small and fragile, just like him. By the third month, Hansu had lost feeling in his hands in the mornings. He would wake up and lie motionless for the first few minutes, waiting for his fingers to start responding. Calluses covered his palms in a solid layer. The skin between them cracked and bled every week. Mother Elva made him bandages from old cloth. Hansu changed them twice a day. By noon, the cloth was soaked pink. By evening, dark red. He paid for his knowledge with the body of a child. Every day. But the plants were growing. The stem rose above his waist, a thick green trunk with stiff leaves. The pods wrapped around it halfway up. Small white flowers appeared in the third week of the third month. Hansu saw them in the morning and stopped. The blooming meant there were 4 or 5 weeks left until the fruits appeared. Maybe 6 in this temperate climate. He didn't know the exact timing, but the flowers were strong, healthy. The soil was doing its job. The compost was halfway mature by this point. Hansu took out the first portion from the bottom layer of the pit. A dark, crumbly mass. It smelled like forest litter. Not sour, not rotten, like soil. He rubbed a clump between his fingers. The texture was good. Not perfect, but more than enough for a first attempt in an unfamiliar world. He spread it in a thin layer around the stems. Mulch on top, the straw he'd been gathering at the edges of the fields for weeks. The garden bed looked different now. Not bare gray clay, but dark, living soil beneath a layer of straw. Tovi came every day. Ronnie and Pico, too. But now 2 more had joined them. Finn, a 10-year-old boy, and his sister Lotta, who was 8. They were the children of the village elder, Grove. They had come on the sly. Finn said their father had forbidden them from going to the pit. But they were curious. Hansu didn't chase them away. He gave Finn the task of collecting ashes from the hearth. He told Lotta to pull weeds for mulch. Grove's children worked harder than anyone else, maybe because they were doing something forbidden, or maybe because they wanted to eat just as much as everyone else. In the 4th week of the 3rd month, Hansu made a decision. The 2x2 garden bed was proof, but you can't feed the village with that. He needed land. More land. He walked around the village's outskirts, alone, early in the morning, before dawn. He looked at the soil. He touched it. He sniffed it. He dug into it with his fingers. On the south side, beyond the stream, he found a plot that no one had cultivated, overgrown with shrubs and wild grass. The soil there was different, darker, softer. The stream fed it moisture. The shrubs held it in place with their roots. Leaves had fallen and rotted over the years, creating a natural compost. Hansu knelt down and scooped up a handful of soil. He brought it to his nose. Rich, alive. You could grow anything here. But the plot was outside the temple grounds. It was communal land, the land of the village elder, Grove. Hansu returned to the village and thought about it all day. Asking Grove was pointless. The elder would sooner burn the plot than give it to a boy. Asking Mother Elva to put pressure on Grove again wasn't right either. She'd saved him once with a rolling pin. A second time might not work. He needed another way. Hansu decided to wait. Wait for the harvest. Wait for proof. Words don't change people's minds. Full bowls do. But while he was waiting, something unexpected happened. Uncle Haas came to see him. the blacksmith, a big, silent man with hands like shovels. He stood by the garden bed and looked at the stalks, which now rose above Hansu's head. He was silent for a long time. Then he said that his granddaughter, Ronnie, liked it here. He said that every evening the girl talked about the holes, the layers, and the worms. Hansu didn't know that Ronnie was Haas's granddaughter. The blacksmith took a bundle out from a bundle from behind his back. He unwrapped it. Inside lay a hoe. Small, light, just right for a child's hand. The blade was sharp. The handle was smooth. Haas said he'd made it last night. He didn't know if it would help. Hansu took the hoe. It fit perfectly in his hand. For the first time in 3 months, he had a real tool. Not a rusty spade with a cracked handle. Not a stick. Not his fingers. A real hoe, forged just for him. Hansu thanked him. Haas nodded. He turned and walked away. At the threshold of the blacksmith's shop, he stopped and said, without turning around, that if the young man needed anything else made of iron, he should come by. Hansu stood there with the hoe in his hands and felt a lump in his throat. Not from sadness, from something else. From the realization that he wasn't entirely alone. The hoe had changed everything. Hansu could now loosen the soil 3 times faster. He could make the furrows straight and deep. He could hill up the stalks without risking damage to the roots. He worked from morning till night. His child's body was adapting, slowly. Muscles that hadn't been there 3 months ago began to show on his thin arms. His back ached, but not as badly. Or maybe he'd gotten used to the pain. One of the two. By the end of the 3rd month, the first pods appeared on the bean plants. Small green pods with 3 or 4 beans inside. Hansu didn't pick them. It was too early. They needed time to ripen. Every morning he checked the pods. He counted them. 12 pods on the first stem, 8 on the second, 15 on the third. The beans were large, larger than the ones that grew in the village's communal fields. The plant produced its first ears toward the end of the month. Small ones. 4 pods per stalk. The seeds were bitter. Hansu tasted one. He grimaced. Mother Elva was right. You can't eat this. But as a support, the stalk worked perfectly. Next season, he'd have to find another grain, one that was edible. That was a task for later. Right now, the beans were the priority. Right now, the proof was the priority. In the last week of the 3rd month, Hansu began collecting green manure seeds. He didn't know the local names. He walked around the neighborhood looking for plants that resembled their earth counterparts. He found something similar to mustard. Yellow flowers, small seeds in pods, a pungent smell. He gathered a handful. He found a grass resembling clover, trifoliate leaves, pink flowers, small roots with swellings. The swellings on the roots are a key characteristic. Bacteria live there that fix nitrogen from the air and release it into the soil. Hansu dug up a single root and examined it. The swellings were there, small white nodules. He squeezed one between his fingers. Inside was pink pulp, active nodules. This is a green manure crop, a real green manure crop. Hansu sat in the field with the root in his hands and smiled. For the first time in 3 months. Clover, or its equivalent, could change everything. Sow the field with this grass for a single season, mow it down and work it into the soil. Nitrogen and organic matter would return to the earth for free. No crystals, no magic, no money. Just grass that grows on its own. He gathered as many seeds as he could carry. He hid them in a dry corner of the barn. He marked the little bag. This was his safety net, his weapon, his quiet revolution. In the evening, he sat by the garden bed. The stalks rustled in the wind. The beans swayed in their pods. The compost in the pit was maturing. The clover seeds lay in the shed. The children were asleep in their homes. Mother Elva blew out the candle in the kitchen. The village was falling silent. Hansu was keeping track in his head. Day 92. The beans are ripening. The stalks are ripening. The compost is 70% ready. He's found a green manure crop. He has the tools. He has helpers. Winter is 2 months away. He won't have time to feed the village this winter. He knew that from day one. But next winter, not a single child will die. In the 6th month, Hansu harvested his first crop. He had been waiting for this day for 180 days. Every morning he checked the pods. Every evening he felt the soil. And now the beans were ripe. The pods had turned yellow and dried out. The seeds inside had become hard and smooth. Hansu picked the first pod. He opened it. 4 large beans, each the size of an adult man's thumbnail. He placed them in the palm of his hand. Heavy, dense, full. In the village's communal fields, the beans this year were half as big, gray and shriveled. These were yellow-green and round as pebbles. Hansu had been harvesting for 3 days, all by himself. Not because there was so much work to do. 2 square meters would take half a day. But he was sorting them. The largest beans went into one bag. These were seeds for the next season. The medium-sized ones in another. That's food. The small and damaged ones in a third. That's compost. Every bean counts. Every bean is life. When he finished, 3 little bags stood before him. 42 beans in the seed bag. The food bag held more than 200. The compost bag held another 30. All from 2 square meters, from a single garden bed behind the shed. Hansu sat in front of the bags and counted. 200 beans. 1 serving of boiled beans is about 30 beans, so this garden bed could feed 6 or 7 people once. Not much. Almost nothing for a village of 80 people, but enough to prove his point. He took the food sack to Mother Elva's kitchen. He poured it out onto the table. The beans clattered against the wood like hailstones. Mother Elva stood and watched. Then she picked up a single bean. She rolled it between her fingers. She looked up at Hans. She didn't say anything. She just started cleaning the pot. That evening, the kitchen smelled different. Not like thin grass soup, but like real food. The beans simmered for 2 hours. Mother Elva added salt and a little fat that she'd been saving for special occasions. Hansu called the children. Tovi, Ronnie, Pico, Fina, and Lotta. The 5 children sat down at the table. Mother Elva divided the beans among their bowls. Each got a handful of hot beans. Tovi ate so fast that he burned his tongue. Ronnie ate slowly, 1 bean at a time. She put one in her mouth and chewed it for a long time. Pico held his bowl with both hands and stared into it as if he were afraid the beans would disappear. Finn swallowed everything in a minute and licked the bowl clean. Lotta started crying. She just started crying. Silently. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she kept eating. Hansu watched them and felt something tighten in his chest. 6 months of work, bloody calluses, back pain, arguments with the village elder, the priest's silence, rain, cold, fear. And here was the result. 5 children were eating real food for the first time in half a year. It wasn't enough. It was monstrously little, but it was a start. The news spread through the village in a single day. The next morning, people came to the garden. Not children, adults, old men and women. They stood and watched. The beanstalks towered over them. Empty beanstalks still clung to it. The soil around it was dark and loose. It was so different from the gray clay of the communal fields that it seemed like a different substance altogether. Someone bent down and touched the soil, brought their fingers to their nose. sniffed, turned to their neighbor and said that this wasn't their soil, that there was no soil like this here, that the boy had cast a spell. Hansu stood nearby and listened. Whispers crept through the crowd. Sorcery. Magic. Maybe the boy was a secret magician. Maybe he'd stolen the crystal of fertility. Hansu stepped forward. He stood before the adults, an 11-year-old boy facing the crowd that had been feeding him out of charity for half a year. He said there was no witchcraft. He said it was compost. He explained. Kitchen scraps, ash, leaves, grass, time. 2 months. The earth heals itself if you help it. The crowd was silent. Then someone asked about the crystals. Hansu replied that crystals weren't necessary, that the earth had lived without crystals for thousands of years before the Order of the Grain began selling them. The silence grew heavy. Hansu realized he had said too much. It was the first time he had ever publicly questioned the necessity of crystals. Grolv stood in the back rows. He watched. He said nothing. His face was inscrutable. Priest Melis stood by the temple wall at a distance. He had heard it too. He remained silent as well. The crowd dispersed, but something had changed. Hansu could feel it. Not hostility, not acceptance, something in between. Interest, fear, hope that fears itself. 3 days later, Priest Melis came to the garden bed, alone, in the evening when no one was watching. Hansu was sitting by the hole, sifting through the compost. Melis stood beside him. He was silent for a long time. Then he said he'd seen the beans. He said their size was unusual. Hansu nodded. Melis asked if it was true that there were no crystals. Hansu confirmed it. Melis sat down on the ground, right in the dust, in his priestly robe. He said he had been taught that without the blessing of the Order of the Grain, the earth could not bear fruit, that the crystals were a gift from the goddess passed down through the order, that rejecting the crystals meant rejecting the goddess. Hansu replied cautiously. He said he was not rejecting the goddess. He said the goddess had taught him to rotate crops and not to leave the earth bare. Mother Elva had told him this. It was before the crystals, so the goddess knew another way. Melis turned pale. He asked how Mother Elva knew this. Hansu said it was from the old scrolls, which no longer exist. Melis was silent for a long time. Then he stood up and brushed off his robe. He said he would think it over, and he left. He didn't say yes or no. He didn't condemn it. He didn't endorse it. He simply left to think. For a priest who 3 months earlier had called Hansu's work blasphemy, this was a huge step. Hansu wasn't deluding himself. Melis hadn't become an ally, but he was no longer an enemy. For now, that was enough. The following week, Hansu began preparing for spring. Winter was just around the corner. The first frosts had already touched the grass in the mornings. The garden bed had given all it could this season. Now it needed to be protected. Hansu covered the ground with a thick layer of straw, 20 centimeters, and laid boards on top so the wind wouldn't blow it away. Under the straw, the soil would breathe all winter long. The worms would continue their work. By spring, the soil would be even richer. He also covered the compost pit with straw and an old mat. The process will slow down in the cold, but won't stop. By spring, a full batch of mature compost will be ready. Hansu laid out the seed pods on a piece of cloth in a dry corner of the kitchen. 42 pods. Each one is etched in his memory. The large, even ones are on the left. The next season will begin with them. Next to them is a small bag of loom. Next to it, mustard. Next to that, stem seeds. His bank, his future. A harsh winter had set in, colder than the last. Snow fell at the start of the first winter month and didn't melt. The wind howled at night. The firewood was running out. The soup was getting thinner and thinner. Hans was freezing like everyone else. He ate very little like everyone else. But every evening before bed, he would recall his plan. Spring. Clover covering 1/10 of the total field. Compost for the garden beds. A new planting of beans. A search for pumpkin seeds. He needs to find a pumpkin. Without it, the three sisters won't work at full strength. He needs to find an edible grain to replace the bitter stalk. He needs to persuade Grolv to give him some land. He had to survive this winter. He added that last item every evening. The child's body was growing weaker on the meager rations. His cheeks had sunken. His ribs stuck out more than they had on the first day. Mother Elva put a little more food in his bowl than in the others. Hansu noticed. He said nothing. He ate. Winter took 2 old people, not children. Not children this time. But the village grew even more tight-knit. Grolv walked around gloomy and silent. Melis performed memorial services at the ruins of the temple. The children didn't play. They stayed indoors. One day, Tovi came to Hansu's kitchen. He sat down next to him. He asked quietly if the beans would grow again in the spring. Hansu replied that they would grow much more than last time. Tovi nodded. Then he said even more quietly that his mother cries every night, that their suffering is coming to an end. Hansu didn't know how to respond to that. 38 years of life and all the knowledge in the world are of no help when a child tells you that his mother is crying from hunger. He placed his hand on Tovi's shoulder. He said that spring would come. That he promised. Tovi pressed himself against his side, small and warm. They sat like that in the darkening kitchen, listening to the wind howling outside the walls. Hansu counted down the days until spring. Each day was like a coin tossed into a well, heavy and irretrievable. Winter dragged on endlessly. But it ended. Everything comes to an end. And on the first morning when the snow began to melt, Hansu went out into the yard. He walked over to the garden bed. He raked aside the straw. The earth beneath it was soft and dark, alive. A worm appeared on the surface and immediately burrowed back in. Hansu watched it and smiled. The earth had survived the winter. He had survived the winter. It was time to begin. Spring arrived wet and cold. The snow melted for a week. Streams flooded the roads. The clay turned to mud underfoot. But Hansu didn't wait. On the second day of the thaw, he went out into the field and began to work. First, he checked the compost pit. He removed the mat and the straw. He reached his hand inside. Warm, crumbly, dark as night. Perfect compost. The winter cold had slowed the process, but hadn't killed it. The bacteria had been working all winter under cover. Hansu scooped up a handful and brought it to his nose. It smelled like the forest after rain. Clean, strong. It was the best thing he'd created in all 6 months. Now he needed some land, more than 2 square meters. Hansu knew that sooner or later he'd have to talk to Grolv, but he decided to approach it from a different angle. The next morning after breakfast, he went to see Mother Elva. He asked if there was any other church land besides the corner behind the barn. Mother Elva thought for a moment. She said that, according to old records, the church owned a strip of land along the south wall all the way to the stream, about 40 steps long and 20 wide. No one had used that land for about 15 years. It had become overgrown with brush. Hansu went to take a look. The strip was exactly where he had found good soil that fall, that very fertile patch by the stream. Church land. Grolv has no claim to it. Hansu returned to Mother Elva and asked for permission to work on this plot. The old nun looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. She said one word. Work. For the next 3 weeks, Hansu cleared the plot. Alone. The children helped when they could, but the bulk of the work fell on him. He had to chop down the brush with a hoe because he didn't have an axe. He had to pull out the roots by hand, drag the stones to the edge. His young body protested every day. His back was on fire by noon. His hands gave out by evening. Calluses would burst open and grow back again. In the second week of clearing, the blacksmith Haas came to see him. He stood silently beside him. He looked at the brush, then he left. An hour later, he returned with an axe. He didn't say a word. He began chopping. Together, they cleared in 3 days what would have taken Hans another week. Haas worked in silence and left in silence, but every morning he came back. When the plot was clear, Hans began to plan. 40 steps by 20 is about 800 square meters, 40 times larger than his first garden bed. There was plenty of room to work here. He divided the plot into 4 sections. The first quarter for beans and stalks, the second for clover, the third for mustard, the fourth would rest under mulch. Next year, the rotation would begin. The clover will move to the beans spot, the mustard to the clover's spot, the beans to the rested quarter. A 4-field crop rotation, a classic. In Jeonju, he used this system for 20 years. Here, the principle is the same. The soil shouldn't yield the same crop 2 years in a row. Each field plays its own role. One feeds people, another feeds the soil. A third keeps pests at bay. The fourth recovers. The cycle is endless. The land can work this way for centuries without depletion, without crystals. Hansu sowed the clover plot first. The seeds are small. He scattered them from his palm in a thin stream. He walked across the entire plot, step by step. Then he covered them with a thin layer of soil. Then he tamped it down with his feet. Clover needs no care. It grows on its own. It fixes nitrogen. It builds up mass. In 2 months, it can be mowed and worked into the soil. Free fertilizer. He sowed mustard next to it. Same principle. Mustard is fast. It grows in a month. The roots break up the dense clay. The leaves suppress weeds. Then everything is worked into the soil. Hans used his entire seed supply for the bean patch, 42 beans. Each one was spaced a palm's width apart. He stuck sticks in the ground nearby for support because the bean plants hadn't sprouted yet. He'll plant the beans next to them later. He covered a quarter of the plot with straw and old leaves, a layer of mulch as thick as a palm. Underneath it, the soil will breathe and regenerate. By fall, this quarter will be the most fertile. Hansu spread the compost over the bean plot in a thin layer. Every handful counted. There was enough compost for half the plot. The rest would have to be grown on bare soil. A comparison would show the difference. Hansu wanted to see the numbers, how much the compost yielded and how much without it. This wasn't just a garden bed, it was an experiment. By the end of the first month of spring, the plot by the stream looked like another world. 4 neat fields marked off with stones. The clover had already sprouted, a green fuzz on the dark soil. The mustard had sprouted even faster. The beans were still silent. They needed more warmth. The village was watching. Hansu could feel their eyes on him. Some looked on with curiosity, others with skepticism. Grove passed by the plot every day on his way to the communal fields. He looked. He didn't stop. He said nothing. One morning, Hansu discovered footprints in the mustard field. Someone had walked through the sprouts during the night. It wasn't an accident. It was on purpose. A path had been trampled right across the rows. Hansu got down on his knees and examined the damage. 16 sprouts had been trampled. Not critical. The mustard would recover. But the message was clear. Someone in the village didn't want him to continue. Hansu didn't try to figure out who. He didn't complain. He didn't put up a fence. He just kept working. The next night, there were no footprints. Nor the night after that. A week later, Tovi whispered to him that it had been Dorn, the son of one of the men who had come with Grove to cover the compost. Dorn was 16 and believed that Hansu was bringing shame to the village with his holes. Tovi said that Dorn had wanted to come back, but his father had forbidden it. Because Mother Elva had spoken with Dorn's father, no one knows what she said, but Dorn never came back. Hansu silently thanked the old nun. She had defended him not with a rolling pin or with words. She protected him with silence, with invisible conversations behind closed doors, through connections he didn't understand. Who was this woman, really? He thought about it more and more often. A former novice. She knew the ancient teachings of the goddess. She had influence over people half her age and 3 times her strength. She had come to this impoverished village 30 years ago. Why? Hansu didn't ask. It wasn't time yet. By the 2nd month of spring, the beans had sprouted, all 42 of them, a 100% germination rate. Hansu stood over the rows and counted the green sprouts. 42. Every bean had sprouted. The seeds he'd selected in the fall were the best, large and healthy. Selection works. Breeding works. In 2 generations, his beans would be twice as large as the wild ones. In 5, they'd become a different variety. By this time, the clover had grown to the height of a palm, a thick green carpet. The flowers hadn't appeared yet, but the mass was growing rapidly. In a month, it would be time to mow and process them. The mustard was growing even faster. The yellow flowers had already bloomed, bright spots against the dark field. It was beautiful. Ronnie came to look at them every day. She said it was the most beautiful place in the village. Hansu smiled. To him, it wasn't just beautiful. To him, it was right. The earth was doing what it was supposed to do. The plants were doing what they were supposed to do. Everything was working. No magic, no crystals, no miracles. Just hard work, knowledge, and patience. Toward the end of the 2nd month of spring, Hansu made another discovery. Drip irrigation. He'd been thinking about it for a long time. In Jeonju, he'd used a drip tape system. There were no tapes here, but there was clay. Hansu molded a pot the size of 2 fists out of clay, unfired. Raw clay is porous. Water seeps through the walls slowly, drop by drop. If you bury such a pot next to a plant and fill it with water, it will water the roots all day long. No overflow, no drying out. Perfect moisture. Hansu buried the first pot next to the beans. He filled it with water from the stream. By evening, the pot was empty. The soil around it was moist to the depth of a palm. It works. He molded 10 more pots over the course of 2 days. His hands ached from the clay, but it was a familiar pain. He distributed the pots throughout the bean field. Now watering took half an hour a day instead of 2. Fetch water from the stream, pour it into the pots. Done. Tovi and Ronnie took on this task. Every morning, the 2 children ran to the stream with buckets. Hansu watched them and thought, in a year, there would be 10 children. In 2 years, 20. He wasn't just growing food, he was raising people. By summer, the plot by the stream had turned into a green island in the middle of the gray village. The beans had climbed up the stakes higher than waist height. The clover had bloomed with pink flowers. The mustard had finished flowering and stood with pods full of tiny seeds. The mulched quarter rested under the straw, gathering strength. Hansu walked between the rows every morning and evening. He checked the leaves. He felt the stems. He counted the pods. The beans grown with compost yielded an average of 18 pods per stem. Without compost, they yielded 11. That's almost half as many. He kept these numbers in his head. Every number was an argument. Every pod was proof. In midsummer, he mowed the clover. He cut it at the base with a hoe. He spread the green mass on the ground in an even layer. Then he dug it over. He worked the clover into the soil to the depth of a palm. The green matter would decompose in 3 weeks, releasing nitrogen and organic matter. By fall, this plot would be ready for planting, for free, without any fertilizer. He worked the mustard into the soil the same way. The mustard roots had loosened the clay to a depth of 2 bayonets. The soil, which a year ago had been as hard as stone, now crumbled in his hands. Hansu picked up clumps and rubbed them between his fingers. The same motion every time, the same joy every time. Grolv arrived at the end of summer, not in the morning or in the evening, but at noon, when everyone could see. He walked through the village to the plot by the stream. He stood at the edge. He looked at the green rows of beans, at the dark, loose soil, at the clay pots sticking out of the ground, at the children running between the rows with buckets. He stood there for a long time. Hansu was working and paid no attention, or pretended not to. Then Grolv called out to him. Hansu approached. Grolv remained silent for another minute. Then he said one sentence. He said he wanted to learn. Hansu looked at the village elder. Grolv didn't apologize. He didn't admit he was wrong. He didn't mention the filled-in hole or Mother Elva's rolling pin. He just stood there and waited for an answer. Hansu nodded. He told him to come back tomorrow morning with a shovel. Grolv nodded in response and left. Tovi stood nearby, watching his grandfather walk away with his mouth agape. He whispered to Hansu that his grandfather had never asked anyone for anything. Hansu replied that Grolv hadn't asked for anything just now either. He had simply said it. Those are two different things. Grolv came the next morning, with a shovel. He stood silently beside Hansu. Hansu showed him how to work green manure into the soil, how to mulch, how to check the moisture with his finger to a depth of 2 phalanges. Grolv listened in silence. He worked in silence. His hands were large and rough. The work went quickly. By noon, the two of them had planted as much as Hansu alone would have done in 3 days. Grolv left without a word. He came back the next morning, and the next. He didn't miss a single day until the end of summer. A week after Grolv, 2 more people arrived, a man named Bars and his wife Nella. They had 3 children and an almost empty pantry. Bars said he'd heard about the beans. He said he wanted to try growing them in his own garden. Hansu gave him 10 seed beans. He showed him how to plant them, how to make compost, and how to mulch. Bars listened carefully. Nella wrote things down with a stick on a small board. Hansu looked at her and thought that next year they would need a school, a real one, with records and a structured system. You can't teach everyone one at a time. We need to teach many at once. But that's for later. Right now, it's summer. Right now, it's harvest time. The beans were ripe by the end of summer. Hansu spent 3 days harvesting them. Now, not from 2 square meters, but from 200. The harvest was incomparable to last year's. 14 sacks of beans, full, heavy sacks. Hansu counted and recounted. 14 sacks, from just 1/4 of the plot, with compost. Without compost, there would have been 8 or 9 sacks, still more than all the communal fields combined had yielded. He sat by the sacks and couldn't get up. Not from exhaustion, from realization. It works. It really works. Not on 2 meters, on 200. The scale has been confirmed. Mother Elva stood in the kitchen doorway and watched as Tovi and Ronnie hauled the sacks into the pantry. The old nun wasn't smiling, but her nun were shining. She turned to Hans and said that this winter the soup would be different. Hans replied that this winter the soup would be thick. That evening, Mother Elva cooked bean porridge, thick, with salt and fat. She called the whole village. For the first time in 5 years, all 80 people gathered in the temple kitchen. Old people and children, men and women, Grolv, Melis, Haas, Bars and Nella with their children, Tovi and Ronnie and Pico, Finn and Lotta. Everyone. They ate in silence, not because they had nothing to say, because their mouths were full. Bean porridge. Simple, filling, real food. Someone started crying. Not just one person, several. Hansu was eating with everyone else. He was sitting on the floor in a corner, a little boy who would turn 12 in a month, with bloody calluses on his hands and back pain that would never go away. He watched the people eating and crying. 14 sacks of beans won't save the village for the whole winter, but they'll provide 2 months of full bellies, 2 months of life, 2 months without dead children. That's not enough. It's never enough. But it's a year's worth of work by one child on a patch of land by the stream. What will happen in a year when the entire plot is working at full capacity? What will happen in 2 years when the communal fields switch to crop rotation? What will happen in 3 years when clover and mustard return to the soil what had been taken from it for 200 years? Hansu finished his porridge. He licked the spoon. He stood up and went out into the yard. The stars were shining over the village. It was quiet. It was cold. The first frost on the grass. Winter is coming. But this time, behind the village, there were 14 sacks of beans and a plan for spring. Hansu looked at his hands. In the darkness, they seemed large, grown up. He clenched his fists and unclenched them. His fingers ached, his knuckles cracked. His body was 12 years old, but his hands were still 38. He went to sleep. Tomorrow he would have to prepare the seed supply for the coming year. The second winter turned out to be milder than the first. Less snow fell. The frosts weren't as severe. Or perhaps the village had simply grown stronger. Bean porridge appeared on the table every other day. Not every day, because Hansu had calculated the supply very carefully. 14 sacks for 4 winter months for 80 people. The portions were small, but it was protein, real protein, the kind the village hadn't seen in years. The children stopped getting sick. Not all of them, but the cough that used to go from house to house every winter affected only 3 this time, and they all recovered. Mother Elva said that she couldn't remember such a mild winter in 30 years. Hansu knew it wasn't about the weather. It was about food. A well-fed child doesn't get sick. A simple truth that this world had forgotten over 200 years of dependence on crystals. Hansu spent the winter planning. Every evening he sat by the hearth in the kitchen and laid out small pebbles in front of him. Each pebble represented a field. White beans, blue clover, yellow mustard, red beets. He moved the pebbles around and counted. A 4-year crop rotation. If they could gain access to at least 1/10 of the communal fields in the spring, they could triple the harvest by the following fall. Grove would come to these evening sessions. He'd sit down beside him. He'd look at the pebbles. He'd listen. Sometimes he'd ask questions. Hansu would explain, simply and slowly. Grove. Once, he picked up the pebbles and laid out the diagram himself. Correctly. Hansu looked at him and nodded. Grove smiled. For the first time in a year, Hansu saw something resembling a smile on his face. The spring of the second year began with a decision that changed everything. Grove convened the village council, 5 elders and himself. They stood by the temple. Grove said he was proposing to give 1/10 of the communal field to the boy. Silence. Then arguments. 2 were against it. 1 was in favor. 2 remained silent. Grove said that in 1 year, the boy had produced more beans from that small patch of temple land than the entire communal field. He said that either they would learn from him, or in 3 years there would be no one left to bury here. The arguments continued until evening. Hansu wasn't present. He was waiting in the kitchen. Tovi ran back and forth, reporting updates. That evening, Grove arrived. He said the council had agreed. 1/10. If, after one growing season, the harvest was worse than on the other fields, they would take the land back. Hansu accepted the terms. He knew the harvest wouldn't be any worse. It would be 3 times better. 1/10 of the communal field was about half a hectare, a huge area for one boy. But Hansu wasn't alone anymore. Grove worked alongside him every day. Haas forged tools. Tovi and Ronnie carried water. Bars and Nella had mastered composting and were already digging their own pits. Finn and Lotta were mulching. A little army. Hansu applied everything he knew to the communal tithe. Crop rotation, green manure, compost, drip irrigation from clay pots, mulching with straw, intercropping, beans next to stalewort, clover between the rows, mustard on empty strips. Not a single bare patch of land. Every square meter was put to work. The results came 4 months later. The harvest from Hansu's tithe plot exceeded the combined harvest of the other 9/10. 3 times as much. Not twice as much as he had promised, but 3 times as much. 26 sacks of beans. 4 sacks of peas from seeds that Bars had found at a merchant's in a neighboring village. 8 baskets of greens. And pumpkins. Finally, pumpkins. Hansu found the seeds in the spring. A merchant passing through the village was carrying a sack of pumpkin seeds. Hansu traded 2 sacks of beans for a handful of seeds. Expensive. Very expensive. But the pumpkin completed the 3 sisters system: the beanstalk for height, beans for nitrogen, pumpkins to cover the ground. The pumpkins grew enormous, each one the size of a child's head, orange and heavy. When Hansu brought the first pumpkin into the kitchen, Mother Elva took it in her hands and held it for a long time. Then she set it on the table. Then she sat down on a bench and covered her face with her hands. Hansu was frightened. He approached her. He touched her shoulder. Mother Elva lifted her face. She wasn't crying. She was smiling. She said the last time she'd seen a pumpkin like that was when she was young, when she served in another place, far from here. Hansu wanted to ask where, but he didn't. It wasn't time yet. The village began to change. Not quickly, slowly, like the earth coming back to life after green manure. People began to walk more steadily. The children began to make more noise. Laughter filled the courtyards. Not joyful, unrestrained laughter, but quiet, calm laughter. The laughter of people who'd eaten. Grove walked through the village and told everyone about crop rotation. He didn't understand everything correctly. He mixed up the terms, but he conveyed the essence accurately. The soil can't produce the same thing every year. It needs to rest. It needs food. Compost is food for the soil. Hansu listened as Grove explained things to the men and smiled to himself. A year ago, this man had wanted to fill in his compost pit. Now he's the village's leading advocate for compost. People are more willing to listen to the village elder than to a young boy. That's normal. That's how it should be. Hansu doesn't need fame. He needs results. In the fall of the second year, Hansu took stock. The village went into winter with a 5-month supply of food, for the first time in 10 years. Not a single fertility crystal had been purchased. Not a single coin had gone to the order of the grain. The land provided on its own, because it was finally being treated right. Hansu sat by the hearth that evening, staring into the fire. He was 12 years old. His back ached like that of a 40-year-old. His hands were calloused. His joints throbbed in the cold. He had given 2 years of his childhood to this land, and the land had responded. But the real problems were only just beginning. A village that doesn't buy crystals attracts attention. And the order of the grain's attention isn't just the village elders grumbling or the priest's sidelong glances. It's power. Real power. Mature power. Dangerous. The mage Veslin arrived at the end of winter, on horseback, alone, a gray cloak bearing the order of the grain's crest, a pouch with 3 fertility crystals at his belt. A routine inspection visit. Once a year, the mage would travel through a dozen villages, inspecting the condition of the fields and selling crystals to those who could pay. Svet Valley was always the last stop on the route, the poorest, the most hopeless. Veslin usually spent half a day here. He'd be turned away because there was no money for a crystal. He'd make a note in his log. Then he'd leave. This time, he lingered. Hansu saw him in the morning from the kitchen window. The man in the gray cloak was standing at the edge field and was watching. He watched for a long time. Then he walked over to the patch by the stream. He stopped, crouched down, touched the ground, picked up a handful, sniffed it, put it back, stood up, and walked toward the village headman's house. Hansu watched. His heart sank. He knew this day would come. A village that doesn't buy crystals attracts attention. A village that doesn't buy crystals and yet thrives attracts dangerous attention. Grove received the mage as was customary. Tea, bread, conversation. Hansu wasn't invited. 12-year-old boys aren't invited to negotiations. But Tovi sat by the window and listened. He ran over to Hans an hour later. He told Hans everything. Veslin had asked about the fields. He asked why the soil by the stream was dark instead of gray. He asked who was tilling it. He asked why the village hadn't ordered crystals this year. Grove answered cautiously. He said they had no money, that they were managing on their own, that a boy at the temple had come up with some method involving pits. Veslin asked who the boy was. Grove said he was an orphan, a nobody. He just pokes around in the dirt. The children are helping. Hansu listened to Tovi's retelling and thought. Grove had done the right thing. He hadn't made Hansu out to be a hero. He hadn't explained the system. He hadn't given Veslin the full picture. He'd made it all seem like child's play. A smart old man. Hansu had been wrong to think that Grove didn't understand. Grove understood everything. He was simply an old man who had survived enough inspections to know how to talk to mages. But Veslin didn't leave. He stayed the night. He asked for a room. Grove couldn't refuse a mage of the order. The next morning, Veslin came to the plot by the stream. Hansu was there. He was loosening the soil with a hoe, preparing the garden beds for spring planting. Veslin stood and watched. A minute, 2, 5. Then he spoke. He asked the boy his name. Hansu told. Veslin asked what he was doing. Hansu replied that he was preparing the soil. Veslin asked how he was doing that without crystals. Hansu looked at the mage. Short, thin, about 35 years old, intelligent, cold eyes, clean hands. Not a farmer. A bureaucrat. A paper man. Hansu answered simply. He said he was putting into the ground what the earth asks for. Waste. Ash. Grass. Everything returns. The cycle. Veslin frowned. He asked if the boy knew what fertility crystals were. Hansu replied that he did, that they were stones that made the soil rich for a single season. Veslin nodded. He asked why the boy thought his holes were better than the crystals. Hansu stopped. He set down his hoe. He looked straight at Veslin. He said that a crystal works for just one season, and then the earth is dead again, and you need a new crystal, and another one, and another, every year, endlessly. But compost, green manure, and crop rotation make the soil stronger every year, without stopping, without money, without the order. The last 2 words hung in the air. Hansu realized he'd said too much, but he didn't back down. Veslin was silent. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, something colder than anger. Calculation. Understanding. The mage saw a threat. Not the boy, the system. If one impoverished village could manage without crystals, then so could another, and a third, and a 10th. And if 10 villages stopped buying crystals, the Order of the Grain would lose a 10th of its income from that district. And if 100 did, then the entire district. Veslin turned and walked away. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't make any threats. He just left. Hansu stood there with his hoe, watching him go. His hands didn't tremble. He'd been expecting this. He'd been preparing for it. He knew that sooner or later the Order would notice. But it's one thing to know, and quite another to stand before a man who can destroy everything you've built with a single denunciation. That evening, Mother Elva called Hansu into the kitchen. She closed the door. She sat down across from him. She said she'd seen the mage by the stream. She said she knew what would happen next. Veslin would write a denunciation. He'll send it to the district. An inspection will arrive in a month, an order in 2 months. In 3 months, they might take the land. Or worse. Hansu asked what was worse. Mother Elva said that the Order of the Grain does not forgive those who undermine the crystal trade. There were villages that had tried. Their village elders were removed. Their fields were confiscated. The people were resettled. Hansu listened and felt a chill run down his spine. Not for himself. For the village. For Tovi and Ronnie. For Pico. For the old folks who had only just begun to eat their fill. He asked what to do. Mother Elva paused. Then she said something strange. She said she needed to write a letter. To an old friend in the capital. She said Hansu shouldn't worry. That she would figure it out. Hansu looked at her. He asked who this friend was. Mother Elva shook her head. She said later. Not now. Hansu didn't press her. But that night, he lay awake for a long time. He lay on his mattress and thought. Who was this old woman? A former novice who knew the teachings of the goddess? Who had friends in the capital? Who had lived in a poverty-stricken village for 30 years by her own choice? Who, from the very first day, had believed in the strange foreign boy digging holes? He didn't know the answers. Not yet, anyway. In the morning, Hansu went out into the field. Veslin had left at dawn. The village awoke quietly. Hansu picked up a hoe and walked over to the garden beds. No matter what happens, the land won't wait. The garden beds need to be prepared. Seeds need to be planted. The children need to be fed. Everything else can wait. The spring of the second year marked the time when Hansu stopped working alone. Grolv converted all the communal fields to a new system. Not all at once, one plot at a time. Every week he came to Hansu and discussed the plan. Which field to set aside for clover, which for mustard, and which to leave for beans. Hansu would lay out pebbles on the kitchen floor and explain. Grolv would listen, memorize the plan, and go out in the morning to give orders. The men of the village listened to the village elder. Not all of them were happy about it. Some grumbled that it was a whim, that they'd been planting the same crops their whole lives, just as their fathers and grandfathers had. Grolv replied briefly. He said that their fathers and grandfathers had gone hungry too, and their children had died. The grumbling subsided. By mid-spring, 5 out of 10 fields had switched to crop rotation. 3 were sown with clover, 1 with mustard, 1 with beans and squash using the Three Sisters method. Hansu ran from field to field. He checked the planting depth, the distance between rows, the thickness of the mulch. He demonstrated how to bury clay pots for watering. Every day, from dawn to dusk. The 12-year-old boy's body was working at its limit. By evening, his back would not straighten. His knees creaked with every squat. But he couldn't stop. Every day lost meant a lost harvest. Haas forged 12 more hoes, different sizes, for men and for children, for heavy clay and for loose soil. He made each hoe in the evenings after his main work in the blacksmith shop. When Hansu asked why he was wasting his time, Haas replied that his granddaughter, Ronnie, had grown 2 fingers over the winter, for the first time in 3 years. He said that was enough by any measure. Hansu didn't know what to say. He simply took a hoe and went to work. A month later, a letter arrived. Or rather, it didn't arrive. It simply appeared on the kitchen table one morning, sealed with wax, no address. Mother Elva took it calmly. She read it, folded it up, and tucked it into her pocket. Hansu asked what was in the letter. Mother Elva said that Veslin's denunciation had been lost. Hansu blinked. He asked how it had been lost. Mother Elva replied that denunciations sometimes get lost. Paper is an unreliable thing. Hansu looked at her and realized that behind that phrase lay a story he didn't yet know. A friend in the capital. A letter with no address. A report that had gone missing. A former novice in a destitute village. He asked no more questions. Mother Elva had closed that door, and Hansu respected closed doors. But he remembered. He remembered everything. The summer of the second year proved to be a turning point. The communal fields, under crop rotation, yielded a harvest 4 times larger than usual. 4 times. Not twice, not 3 times. 4 times. Grolv stood at the edge of the field and looked at the sacks. He counted and recounted. Then he turned to Hansu. He didn't say a word, but he took off his hat. In the village, that meant more than any words could. The men who had grumbled in the spring came silently to Hans and asked how to cultivate the remaining 5 fields. Hans showed them. He explained it to each one, patiently, 10 times if necessary. He never raised his voice. He never rushed anyone. He simply gestured with his hands and waited until the person understood. By fall, all 10 communal fields were being worked under the new system. Compost pits stood behind every house. The whole village was now making clay pots for watering. Mother Elva cooked a stew with beans, pumpkin, peas, and greens, thick, fragrant, and filling. The children ate twice a day. The elders ate twice a day, for the first time in 200 years. Hansu sat by the hearth in the evening and kept track in his head. Year 2. The total harvest was 51 sacks of grain and beans, 12 baskets of vegetables, 18 pumpkins, 6 months' worth of winter supplies, 0 crystals purchased. For the first time, the village had a surplus. Grolv suggested selling part of the grain to the neighboring village. Hansu agreed, but he added one condition: to sell not for money, but for seeds. They needed new crops: carrots, onions, garlic, cabbage, the real kind, not that scrawny junk that had been growing here for the past 10 years. Greens, herbs. Every new seed is a new opportunity. Grolv nodded. He sent Bars with 2 sacks of beans to the merchants. Bars returned a week later with a linen bag. Inside were 12 little bags of seeds: carrots, onions, radishes, 2 kinds of cabbage, sweet peas, and 4 varieties of herbs that Hansu didn't recognize. He went through the bags, sniffing each one, opening them and examining the seeds. He felt them. He tested them with his teeth. The farmer inside him was working at full capacity. 2 varieties of cabbage resembled earths. The seeds were large and smooth. Germination would be good. The carrots were small. They needed light, loose soil. There was such soil in the 4th field after a year of mulching. The onions were large. That meant it was a good variety. They'll grow on compost. Hansu laid out the bags on the table and drew up a planting plan for spring. Each crop in its own place. Carrots after beans, because the beans enriched the soil with nitrogen. Cabbage after clover, because cabbage loves rich soil. Onions separately, because onions don't tolerate competition. peas next to instead of beans for variety. The crop rotation was getting more complicated. 4 crops had become 12, 10 from a single plan. Hansu kept it all in his head, for now, but he knew he'd soon have to write it down. He needed paper. He needed ink. He needed a system for keeping records. He needed a school. He approached Melis. The priest was sitting by the temple, mending a torn scroll. Hansu sat down beside him. He asked if the priest could teach him to write. Melis looked up. He looked at the boy for a long time. Then he asked why. Hansu replied that he needed to write things down, that there was too much in his head, and soon he would start to forget. That if he forgot and others didn't know, everything he had done would disappear. Melis was silent. Then he said something strange. He said that the goddess values those who write things down, that the first priests were scribes, that knowledge which is not written down dies along with the person. Hansu nodded. Melis took a piece of birch bark and a charcoal stick out of his bag. He wrote the first letter. He showed it to Hansu. He said it was the letter for earth. The word soil begins with it. Hansu took the charcoal stick and tried it himself. The line came out crooked. His hand was used to a hoe, not a quill. But he tried again, and again, and again. Melis sat beside him, correcting his strokes. Patiently, quietly. 2 people who, a year ago, had been on opposite sides now sat side by side, writing letters on birch bark. The priest, who had once considered the boy's work a blasphemy, was teaching this boy to write. The world does not change through battles or miracles. The world changes through a full bowl and patience. The 3rd year began with an event no one had expected. Strangers arrived in the village. 5 men on horseback. Their clothing was sturdy, leather boots, short swords at their belts. They rode in at dawn while Hansu was out in the distant field checking the clover for the winter. Tovi came running, out of breath. He said that Baron Hart's men had arrived. Hansu straightened up. Baron Hart, a neighbor, the owner of 3 villages to the west. Greedy and lazy, according to Grolv. Hansu had never seen him and never thought about him. He had enough worries without barons. But the baron was thinking about him, or rather about his harvest. Rumors spread quickly. Merchants who bought beans from Light in the Valley were talking about it at the markets. A destitute village near a ruined temple had suddenly started selling grain. Lots of grain. Good grain. No crystals. The baron heard about it and took an interest. Hansu returned to the village. 5 of Garth's men were standing by the village headman's house. Grolv was talking to them. His face was stony. Hansu approached. He stood next to Grolv. The eldest of the baron's men looked at him from head to toe. A boy, 12 years old, dirty hands, pants caked in clay. He turned back to the village headman. Hansu listened. The baron's men spoke politely, but behind that politeness lay power. The baron was inviting the village headman of Light in the Valley to a meeting. The baron was interested in new farming methods. The baron was ready to buy seeds and seedlings. A good price. A very good price. Grolv replied that he would think it over. The baron's men nodded. They said they would return in 2 weeks for an answer. They left. Grolv turned to Hans. He said he didn't like this. Hans replied that neither did he. The baron isn't buying. The baron is taking. A difference in words, but not in substance. If they sell the seeds and seedlings, the baron will try to replicate the system on his own. It won't work because the system isn't just the seeds. The system is compost, crop rotation, green manure, irrigation, and knowledge. Seeds without knowledge are just grains in dead soil. But the baron doesn't understand that. And when it doesn't work out, he'll get angry. And an angry baron with swords is more dangerous than a hungry winter. Hansu thought about it for 2 days. Then he made a decision. He told Grove that they had to refuse, politely, to say that they needed the seeds for themselves, that the harvest was still meager, that there was nothing to share. Grove shook his head. He said you don't refuse the Baron, that Garth could simply come and take them. The village wouldn't be able to stop 5 armed men. Hansu fell silent. He knew Grove was right. Mother Elva entered the kitchen. She had overheard the conversation. She said she knew Baron Garth, that he was greedy but cowardly, that he wouldn't attack a village under the temple's protection. Grove objected, saying the temple was destroyed and offered no protection. Mother El smiled. She said that the temple was destroyed, but the goddess was not, and that the goddess's seal on the village gates still held power. Anyone who attacked the temple grounds would be cursed. The Baron might be greedy, but he was superstitious. Grove looked at the nun, then he nodded. He said he would try. 2 weeks later, the Baron's men returned. Grove refused, politely. He mentioned the temple, he mentioned the goddess. The eldest of the Baron's men listened. His expression didn't change. He nodded. He left. Hansu stood around the corner and watched. He didn't believe this was the end. He didn't believe it, and he turned out to be right. A month after the refusal, Hansu was awakened by a scream. Tovi was running across the yard, shouting. Hansu rushed out of the kitchen. He ran after Tovi to the plot by the stream. He stopped. 3 rows of beans had been pulled up by the roots. The bed with the pumpkin seedlings had been torn up. The seed bags that Hansu had kept in the shed by the stream were gone. The ground around them was trampled by horse hooves. At night, while the village slept, someone came and took them. Hansu stood over the dug-up bed and stared. His arms hung at his sides. His legs gave way. He sank to his knees. The pumpkin seedlings. He'd been growing them since fall, from those very seeds he'd traded for 2 sacks of beans. 20 seedlings. Each one staked and covered for the winter. Each had survived the frosts, and now they lay in the mud with their roots torn off. Seed pods. 4th generation beans. The best of the best. Large. The very best. 2 years of selective breeding. Hansu closed his eyes. The 38-year-old man inside him wanted to scream. The boy on the outside remained silent. Grove arrived a minute later. He stood beside him, looked at the tracks, said one word. Gart. Hansu opened his eyes, stood up. He brushed the dirt off his knees. He looked at Grove. He said they needed to count the losses. They counted until noon. 3 rows of beans out of 12. All the pumpkin seedlings. The seed supply of beans and peas. The clover seeds were untouched. Apparently, the thieves didn't know what they were. The mustard was intact too. The stalks were untouched. The hoes were still there. 5 out of 20 clay pots were broken. Hansu sat down on a rock by the stream. Grove sat down beside him. They were silent. Then Hansu said that they still had seeds preserved in Mother's library. Old little bags on the top shelf of the kitchen. The very ones he'd started with in his first year. Grove asked if there were enough. Hansu replied that there were, that they'd restore the crop in 2 seasons. That they'd have to start the selection process over from the beginning, but the principle was the same. Select the best. Plant the best. 1 step forward every year. Grove asked what to do about the Baron. Hansu replied that nothing needed to be done, that the Baron had stolen the seeds but hadn't stolen the knowledge, that without a proper cultivation system, the seeds would yield him only 1 harvest, maybe 2. Then the land would die again, and the Baron would return to the crystals. But they would move on. Grove looked at the boy. Then he nodded. He stood up. He walked to the village. Hansu stayed by the stream. He sat there until evening. He watched the water. he thought. Back in Jeonju, his entire strawberry crop had once been stolen. A neighbor's worker had carried off 20 crates in the middle of the night. Hansu found him a week later. He didn't press charges. He simply planted new strawberry plants. 2 years later, his strawberries were the best in the county. Theft is a waste of time, nothing more. Time can be made up. Knowledge cannot be stolen. In the evening, he came into the kitchen. Mother Elva was sitting at the table. In front of her were 3 little bags of seeds. Old ones, the very ones from the top shelf. Hansu sat down across from her. He opened the first one. Beans. Small ones. First generation. Before selection. 2 winters on the shelf. The germination rate will be 60%. Maybe 50%. The second bag. Peas. The third, a stalk. Hansu counted them. 40 beans, 30 peas. Enough stalks. He could start with this. Not quickly, not easily, but it was possible. Mother Elva looked at him. Then she said that Hansu reminded her of someone. A long time ago. Somewhere else. That person never gave up either. Hansu asked who. Mother Elva shook her head. She said, "Later." Hansu nodded. Later, then. The next morning, he went out to the field. He cleared away the dug-up beds. He leveled the soil. He soaked the seeds. And he started over. The restoration took the entire 3rd year. Hansu worked methodically and patiently. The old seeds had a germination rate of 55%. 22 beans out of 40. Every very sprout counted. Hansu tended to them as if they were sick children. Watering twice a day, handfuls of compost, a thick, even layer of mulch, protection from the wind, the stems tied to stakes from the very first week. Not a single sprout died after emerging. 22 plants yielded 14 sacks by fall. Less than last year, but enough to keep the village from going hungry. They had to search for a new pumpkin variety. Hansu sent Bars to the merchants with 3 sacks of beans. Bars returned with seeds 10 days later. A different variety of pumpkin, smaller than the last one, but still a pumpkin. Hansu planted it and harvested 12 fruits by fall. Small ones, about the size of an adult man's fist. But this was the beginning of a new cycle. After 2 generations of selective breeding, they would be larger. The main discovery of the 3rd year took place not in the field, but in Hansu's mind. He realized he couldn't teach everyone one by one. The village had grown, not in numbers, there were still the same 80 people, but now everyone wanted to learn. Every day, someone would come with a question. When to plant clover? How deep to bury the pots? How much compost to put per square meter? Hansu answered, patiently, everyone. But there are only so many hours in a day, and the questions kept multiplying. He went to see Melis. The priest had been teaching him to read and write for half a year already. Hansu wrote slowly but legibly. He read faster. He asked Melis if he could open a school, not a literacy school, but a school of the land, a place where he could teach 10 people at once. Melis looked at him, thought for a moment, then said they could use the temple. The roof had caved in, but the walls were still standing. If they covered the hole with oiled canvas and set up benches, it would make a classroom. Hansu looked at the temple with new eyes. Thick walls, a stone floor, a large space inside. Yes, this could work. Haas knocked together the benches in 2 days. Grove hauled in planks for the roof. Bars helped stretch the oilcloth. Melis cleared the temple's interior of debris and stones. They worked for 4 days. On the 5th day, Hansu stood inside the temple and looked at the 10 benches arranged in a semicircle. In front of them was a wall covered with a thin layer of clay. Hansu could write on it with a charcoal stick, a blackboard, improvised but functional. The School of the Earth. He held his first class for the villagers. 14 people came: Grolv, Bars, Nella, Haas, 6 women who tended the vegetable gardens, and 4 older children, including Tovi and Finn. Hansu stood before them, a 12-year-old boy facing grown adults. He paused. Then he began to speak. He spoke about soil, what soil is, what it's made of, why it dies, how it comes back to life. In simple words, without technical terms. He drew on the clay wall the crop rotation cycle: 4 fields, 4 years. Each field rests once every 4 years. Each field receives compost once every 2 years. Each field is sown with green manure once every 3 years. People listened. Some nodded, some frowned. Nella took notes on a small slate. Tovi looked at Hansu with an expression Hansu couldn't read: pride, or surprise, or both. After class, Grolv approached him. He said that half the class hadn't understood. Hansu replied that in 5 sessions, everyone would understand. Grolv snorted. He said Hansu was a cocky kid. Then he smirked and walked away. A month later, classes were held twice a week. Hansu taught agriculture. Melis taught the alphabet after Hansu. The priest stood before the same people in the same and showed them how to write the names of plants, how to count sacks, how to keep harvest records. 2 teachers who, a year ago, had stood on opposite sides were now working in the same temple. One day after the evening lesson, Melis lingered. Hansu was washing the clay wall with a rag, preparing it for the next day. Melis sat on a bench and said nothing. Then he said he had an idea. He said he wanted to write a book, not a scroll, a book, about the earth and the goddess, about how the ancient teachings of the goddess align with what Hansu does, about crop rotation and prayers, about compost and gratitude to the earth. Hansu stopped. He set down the rag. He looked at the priest. Melis spoke softly. He said that all his life he'd thought the goddess spoke through crystals, that the order was the voice of the goddess, that without the order, the earth was dead. And then a boy came along with a hole behind the barn and in 2 years proved that the goddess speaks through the earth itself, without intermediaries, without crystals, without the order. Hansu sat down beside him. He said that a book was a good idea. He said he would share all the knowledge he had, all the numbers, all the diagrams, all his observations, and Melis would put them into words, because Hansu writes slowly, but Melis writes quickly. Melis nodded. From that evening on, they worked together every night. Hansu dictated. Melis wrote. Page after page, chapter after chapter. Composting, crop rotation, green manure, mulching, irrigation, seed selection, companion planting. Everything Hansu knew from his past life adapted to the realities of this world. Melis wove in quotes from the goddess's teachings. He didn't make them up. He found fragments of old prayers in his memory that spoke of the earth, of the cycle, of gratitude, of patience. Hansu listened and was amazed every time. The goddess of the harvest had known all this 1,000 years ago. Crop rotation, compost, mulch, it was all in her teachings. Someone had buried this knowledge. Someone had replaced it with crystals. And Hansu understood more and more clearly who. The order of the grain. 200 years ago, they found a mine with minerals, potassium and phosphorus, common fertilizers. They wrapped them up in pretty packaging, called them a gift from the goddess, and sold them to an entire continent. And they burned the old teachings, or let them burn, just as the roof of the temple in Svet Vodolini 20 years ago. along with the scrolls. Hansu sat at night poring over the manuscript and thinking. He couldn't prove it, not yet anyway. But the book would be the first step. The book would show that the earth doesn't need crystals, that knowledge had always been there, that it had been stolen. In the morning, he went out into the field again. During the day, he taught at school. In the evening, he dictated to Melissa. At night, he fell asleep on his mattress instantly. The body of a 12-year-old boy was working itself to the bone. His back ached constantly, not in waves, but with a steady, unceasing hum. His knees swelled by evening. His fingers went numb in the mornings. Mother Elva made him drink a bitter herbal decoction. She said it was for his bones. Hansu drank it without question. He trusted her. By the end of the 3rd year, the manuscript numbered 40 pages. Thick sheets of birch bark bound with string. On the cover, Melis had written the title, Earth and the Goddess, Practice and Faith. Hansu held the manuscript in his hands and felt its weight. 40 pages. 3 years of his life. Everything he knew. Everything he had done. On paper. Or rather, on birch bark. But it was a book. His first book. It would change the world. Slowly, imperceptibly, page by page, just as compost changes the earth, layer by layer. The 4th year began with a rumor. A merchant passing through the village said that 3 days' journey to the east lay a village that had also renounced the crystals. Hansu listened and didn't believe it. He asked for more details. The merchant said the village was called Grey Ravine, that the village head there had heard about compost pits somewhere and tried it. The results were modest, but it was a start. Hansu sat by the hearth and thought. Grey Ravine. A 3-day journey. Who one of the merchants must have told them. Or perhaps one of Baraz's students who had traveled to get seeds. Information spreads on its own. Without a school, without a book, just by word of mouth. This was both frightening and heartening at the same time. Heartening because knowledge lives on. Frightening because misguided knowledge is dangerous. Compost without the right proportions can burn the roots. Crop rotation doesn't work without an understanding of green manure. If Sarilog does this haphazardly, they could lose a season, or 2. Hansu made a decision. He needed to teach not only his own village, he needed to teach the neighbors. The school must be open to all. He announced this at the next class. He said he was inviting students from other villages, any village, for free. Grove frowned. He said outsiders would learn their secrets. Hansu replied that there were no secrets, that knowledge doesn't diminish when you share it. On the contrary, the more people who know, the stronger the system. Grove grumbled but didn't argue. By mid-spring, the first students from outside arrived. 3 boys from the village over the hill, 2 men from Greylog, 1 woman from the settlement at the crossroads. 6 outsiders sat on benches alongside the 14 locals. The temple had become cramped. Haas knocked together 5 more benches. Hansu taught in the morning, Melis taught in the afternoon. In the evening, everyone worked in the fields. The students from outside the village lived in the temple's empty rooms. Mother Elva fed them from a communal pot. No one objected. The village was used to sharing. When you have more than enough, it's easy to share. At the beginning of summer in the 4th year, a carpenter arrived. A man in his 40s named Karis. He was accompanied by his wife and 2 children. His youngest daughter, 14 years old, was named Tala. Karis didn't come to study. He came to work. He'd heard that they were building in Light in the Valley, that they needed hands skilled at cutting wood. Hansu was indeed building. New compost bins made of planks, frames for greenhouses, supports for irrigation. shelving for storing seeds. They needed a lot of wood. They needed even more carpenters. Karras turned out to be quiet and skilled. His hands were precise. His work was neat. In a week, he built 4 compost bins that were the best the village had put together in 3 years. Hansu worked alongside him. He showed him the measurements and proportions. Karras listened. He worked. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. Paula helped her father the first few days. She handed him tools. She carried planks. A quiet girl with dark hair and attentive eyes. Hansu noticed her on the 3rd day. She was standing by the garden bed, looking at the pumpkin vines. She wasn't just looking, she was studying them. She touched the leaves, she checked the ovaries. Hansu walked over. He asked if she found it interesting. Tala replied that she did, that she had never seen such large leaves, that pumpkins didn't grow at all in their old village. Hansu showed her how to check the soil's moisture level, how to tell if the compost was ready by its color and smell, how to count the days until harvest. Tala listened in silence. She memorized everything. The next day she came back, and the day after that. Hansu didn't think much of it. To him, she was a student, just another pair of hands, another mind that could remember and pass on knowledge. He was 13, she was 14. Children, both of them. But Tala turned out to be more than just a student. She could read. Karras had taught her in early childhood. She could count, quickly and accurately. Hansu gave her assignments and she finished them ahead of schedule. She counted sacks, recorded the harvest, and kept track of the seeds. By midsummer, Hansu realized that Tala was doing what he himself didn't have enough hands to do. She kept a field journal, every day. Which field was planted with what, when it was watered, how much compost was applied, when the seedlings emerged, when they bloomed, when the harvest took place. Hansu checked the records in the evenings. Accurate, detailed, neat handwriting. He looked at her one evening as she sat at the table writing by candlelight. Her dark hair fell across her face. She tucked it behind her ear with a practiced motion. Hansu turned away and went out into the yard. He was 13. It wasn't the right time. It just wasn't time. The summer of the 4th year brought a record harvest. All 10 communal fields were in full rotation. The temple plot by the stream had been doubled in size. There were 22 compost pits throughout the village, more than 100 clay pots for watering. The result? 47 sacks of grain and beans, 30 baskets of vegetables, 22 pumpkins, carrots, onions, radishes, cabbage, peas. The village of 80 hungry mouths had become a village that sold food. Grolv sat by the sacks and shook his head. He said he couldn't believe his eyes. Hansu stood nearby, not smiling, because he knew the sacks were only part of it. The main thing was the people. 14 of his own students who could tend the fields on their own. 6 outsiders who would take this knowledge home with them. A 40-page book that Melis was rewriting for each student. Tala's notebook with entries that, in 10 years, would form the basis for the 2nd edition. Knowledge was spreading. For free. Without crystals. Without the order. Like seeds carried by the wind across the fields. As summer drew to a close, Mother Elva invited Hansu over for evening tea. Alone. Without Grolv. Without Melis. She closed the door. She poured tea. She sat down across from him. She was silent for a long time. Then she said she was 69 years old, that her strength was fading, that the winters were getting harder. Hansu listened and felt his heart tighten. Mother Elva said she would soon tell him everything, who she was, where she came from, why she had come here 30 years ago. She said he deserved to know. But not today. Today she just wanted to have some tea with the boy who had changed her village. They drank tea in silence. It was getting dark outside the window. Children were laughing in the yard. Somewhere, Karis's hammer was pounding. The smell of pumpkin porridge filled the air. Hansu looked at the old woman across a table and thought that without her, there would have been nothing. No compost, no school, no books, no harvest. Without her rolling pin and closed doors and quiet conversations and letters with no address. Without her faith in the boy who dug holes. He wanted to tell her that, but he didn't. He just drank his tea. Some things don't need to be said out loud. They're understood anyway. In his 4th year, a casual remark turned everything Hansu knew about Mother Elva upside down. He was sitting in the kitchen one evening, going over the harvest records with Tala. Mother Elva was washing dishes by the hearth. Tala asked why clay watering pots had to be made from unfired clay. Hansu explained that fired clay doesn't let water through. Raw clay, on the other hand, is porous. Water seeps through the walls drop by drop. Tala wrote it down. Then she asked if there was anything in the goddess's book about watering. Hansu turned to Mother Elva. He asked if she remembered anything from the old scrolls. Mother Elva didn't turn. She continued washing the bowl. And she said calmly that in the temple of the great priestess there was an entire hall dedicated to water, with murals on the walls, jugs buried in the ground next to every tree. She remembers because she herself used to wash the floors in that hall every morning. Silence. Hansu froze. Tala looked up from her notebook. Mother Elva set down the bowl. She turned around. She looked at Hansu. She realized she had said more than she meant to. Hansu asked quietly. He asked if she had been to the temple of the high priestess. Mother Elva sat down on a bench. Her hands were wet. Her face was weary. She said yes. 35 years ago, she had been a novice under the high priestess of the goddess of the harvest. A young girl from a poor family. She scrubbed the floors. She carried water. She listened to the teachings. She served in the temple for 5 years. Then she left. Hansu asked why she had left. Mother Elva was silent for a long time. Then she said that the high priestess had sent her away. She said there was a need for someone in a destitute village far from the capital, someone who would wait. Hansu asked what she was to wait for. Mother Elva looked him in the eyes. She said to wait for the one who would change the order of things, the one who would prove that the land did not need crystals. The high priestess knew the truth. She knew that crystals were a deception, that the order of the grain had replaced the goddess's teachings with commerce. But she couldn't break the system from the top. Too much money, too much power, too many people who feed off this lie. It had to be broken from the bottom up. Someone was needed who would show that things could be different, small, inconspicuous, without ore seals. Just a person who works the land. Hansu sat there, unable to move. 35 years. Mother Elva had waited 35 years. In a destitute village, amid hunger and cold, amid dying children and empty fields, she waited for someone to come and start digging. And he came. An 11-year-old boy with the memory of a Korean farmer. He asked quietly. He asked if she knew it would be him. Mother Elva shook her head. She said she didn't know. She said she'd seen dozens of children over the past 30 years. Orphans came and went. They grew up and left. Not a single one stayed close to the land. Not a single one looked at the garden beds with the eyes of someone who understands. And then Hansu came, and on his first morning, he went out into the yard and looked out at the fields. And she saw it, in his eyes, in the way he looked, not like a child, like a man who knows what he's seeing. Hansu remembered his first morning, the grass soup, the dead fields, the stunted cabbage. He looked through the eyes of a farmer with 30 years of experience, and the old nun saw that look. Tala sat beside her, holding her breath. Mother Elva continued. She said that the high priestess was alive, that she was over 80, but she was alive, that she knows about light in the valley, that the letters Mother Elva had been writing all these years were sent to her, that Veslin's denunciation was intercepted by the priestess's people, that the seal on the village gate is renewed secretly every year, that the village is under protection and always has been. Hansu listened, and the world around him was being reshaped. It wasn't crumbling, it was being reshaped. Like a field after green manure, the same earth, but with a different structure. Mother Elva isn't just a kind old woman. She's an agent, an observer, a guardian, sent here 35 years ago and waiting patiently, like clover in the soil, quietly, unnoticed, doing her work. Hansu stood up. He walked across the kitchen. He stopped by the window. He looked out at the dark fields, then he turned around. He asked one thing. He asked why the high priestess hadn't come herself. Why she hadn't destroyed the order of the grain with her power. After all, she is the head of the faith. Her word is law for every priest on the continent. Mother Elva replied quietly. She said that the high priestess had tried. 20 years ago, she issued a decree to return to the old ways. The order ignored it. The 3 priests who supported the decree were removed. The 2 temples that refused to use crystals were burned to the ground. The high priestess realized she could not win by force. The order had grown over 200 years. It had become more than a faith. It had become an economy. It had become politics. It had become power. It could only be broken by proof, a living, working example that crystals were unnecessary. And that example had to come from below, from the earth, from the people, not from a decree from above. Hansu nodded. He understood. He was a tool. No, not a tool. He was a seed. Mother Elva planted him in this soil and waited for him to sprout. Only she didn't know what kind of seed would fall. She simply waited. And she waited until it happened. Tala touched his hand. He looked at her. She looked at him calmly, without fear, without surprise, as if she had always known that something much... Hansu sat back down. He looked at Mother Elva. He asked what would happen next. The old nun said that the high priestess wanted to see him. Not now, in a year, when the school had grown stronger, when there were enough students, when the evidence was irrefutable. Then the high priestess would come herself, quietly, without an entourage. She'll see it with her own eyes, and she'll make a decision. Hansu asked what decision. Mother Elva replied that she didn't know. She only knew that the high priestess had been waiting just as long as she had, and that the high priestess's patience wasn't infinite. Hansu stepped out into the courtyard. Night, stars, cold air. He stood there, breathing. His head was buzzing. The high priestess, the order of the grain, a conspiracy spanning 200 years, a secret war over land and knowledge. And he was right in the middle of it. A 13-year-old boy with calluses and a sore back. He looked at his hands. In the darkness, they were just hands. Not a child's, not an adult's, just hands that knew how to work the land. That was enough. The 5th year began quietly. Hans turned 14. No one celebrated. In the village, they didn't celebrate orphans' birthdays. But Mother Elva baked a flatbread with honey and left it on the table. Hansu ate it in the morning before work. The honey was a little bitter. Wild bees. Tala had found a hive in the grove beyond the stream that fall, and Haas had helped build a smoker out of an old tin can. Now the village had honey. Not much, 1 pot a month, but honey nonetheless. Hansu added beekeeping to the school's curriculum. The school grew. 10 students from 5 neighboring villages, 3 from Greylog, 2 from the settlement at the crossroads. One boy came from a village beyond the mountain pass. He walked for 4 days. He heard about it from a merchant and came. Hansu gave him a place in the temple and taught him from scratch. Melis now taught classes every other day: literacy, arithmetic, the basics of the goddess's teachings. The book Earth and the Goddess had been copied 6 times. Each student received a copy when they went home. 40 pages of birch bark bound with string. Melis wrote them in the evenings by candlelight. His hand ached, his eyes watered, but he wrote. Each copy was a seed planted in another village. Hansu taught agriculture every morning. Tala helped. She had quietly become his right-hand woman. She took notes. She prepared materials. She explained to the younger students what Hansu had explained too quickly. She had a gift for simplifying things. Hansu spoke of nitrogen fixation by bacteria in the nodules of legumes. Tala said that little friends lived in the roots of the beans and fed the earth with air. The children understood Tala more quickly. Hansu wasn't offended. He was glad. Because it wasn't about who explained it. It was about them understanding. In the spring of the 5th year, something happened that Hansu hadn't expected. A man rode up to the village on a weary horse. Alone. Unarmed. A gray cloak bearing the coat of arms of the Order of the Grain. Tovi was the first to run up. He said the mage had returned. Hansu went out. He looked. It was Veslin. The very same mage inspector who had left 3 years ago with cold eyes. The one who had written the denunciation. Hansu stood at the gate and watched. Veslin dismounted. He tied the horse to a post. He took off his cloak with the coat of arms and folded it into his saddlebag. He was left in a plain shirt. He approached Hansu. He stood in silence. Then he said he had come to study. Hansu was silent for a long time. He looked at the mage. His gaunt face had aged. Dark circles were visible under his eyes. His hands were unkempt, not the hands of a bureaucrat, but those of a man who had traveled a long way without servants. Hansu asked why.